Bioethics, the 23andMe scandal. We're talking about privacy, consent, and genetic ownership. The rise of direct-to-consumer genetic testing has revolutionized the way individuals engage with their health and ancestry. Companies like 23andMe have offered consumers unprecedented access to personal genetic information, allowing them to trace their ancestry, identify genetic predispositions to disease, and even connect with distant relatives. However, as 23andMe faces financial turmoil and potential bankruptcy, its ethical shortcomings have come under scrutiny, particularly regarding the ownership, security, and potential misuse of genetic data. This presentation examines these ethical dilemmas surrounding genetic privacy, informed consent, and corporate responsibility, arguing that stronger bioethical and legal protections are necessary to prevent the exploitation of genetic information. Direct-to-consumer genetic testing has offered significant benefits, from advancing personalized medicine to aiding individuals in understanding hereditary health risks. 23andMe, which was founded in 2006, became a leader in this space, providing affordable genetic analysis to millions. However, despite these advantages, the company's practices raise some serious ethical concerns. These concerns involve privacy, consent, and genetic ownership. One of the most pressing ethical concerns with 23andMe is the security of sensitive genetic data. In 2023, a major data breach exposed the personal information of nearly 6.9 million users, including genetic profiles and family connections. The breach not only compromised individuals' privacy, but also posed a significant risk for genetic discrimination and identity theft. The bioethical principle of autonomy dictates that individuals should have control over who has access to their genetic information and how it is used. But the data breach and third-party monetization demonstrated that 23andMe failed to adequately protect this data. Even if this was all done in the spirit of science and good intent, 23andMe may be exposing individuals to potential discrimination, identity theft, and unforeseen consequences of data misuse by violating core bioethical principles. Moreover, the potential bankruptcy of 23andMe raises critical questions about the future of consumer genetic data. Unlike traditional medical records, which are safeguarded under HIPAA, direct-to-consumer genetic testing is not federally protected in the same way. This means that individuals who voluntarily submit their DNA to companies like 23andMe forfeit control of all the most personal information stored within their DNA. According to the company's privacy policy, the genetic data of millions around the world may be transferred or sold in the event of financial insolvency. This raises the ethical issue of whether a corporation should have the right to commodify genetic information, especially without explicit consent from users. Another major ethical concern is informed consent, which by definition requires that individuals fully understand and voluntarily agree to allow the use of their personal data. However, many 23andMe customers were unaware that their genetic information was being sold to third parties, including pharmaceutical companies, to be monetized. While 23andMe marketed itself as a consumer service, it also engaged in lucrative partnerships with pharmaceutical companies, including a $300 million deal with GlaxoSmithKline, GSK. These partnerships allowed pharmaceutical companies access to massive genetic data sets for drug development. While such research can contribute to medical advancements, the ethical issue lies in whether users were truly aware that their DNA would be used for profit. This lack of transparency in data usage violates autonomy, a key bioethical principle that ensures individuals have control over their own genetic information. The principle of respect for persons in bioethics emphasizes that individuals should be provided with all the information necessary to make informed decisions about their participation in research. However, 23andMe data sharing practices suggest that users were not given full transparency about how their genetic information would be used. The company relied on complex and lengthy consent forms that many consumers likely did not read in detail. This lack of transparency undermines the very foundation of ethical genetic research. 23andMe's partnership with pharmaceutical companies such as GSK raised concerns about misleading transparency and informed consent. The company's terms of service and consent forms are often more than 20 pages long, filled with complex legal and technical language that most users don't read. In many cases, consumers unknowingly agree to data sharing by failing to uncheck a pre-selected box in their account settings. Once DNA is submitted, it's unclear whether the company has the right to use that data indefinitely, leading to ethical questions about the limits of consent. Overall, this raises important bioethical concerns. Is it truly possible for users to give informed consent when they may not fully understand how their genetic information is being used? According to the Belmont Report, informed consent must meet 3 criteria. First off is information. The individual must be given clear, accessible explanations of how their data will be used. Second is comprehension. Consumers must be able to understand what they are agreeing to. And third is voluntariness. Consent must be freely given without coercion or deceptive marketing. If users don't truly comprehend how their data is being used, then their consent is not ethically valid. Another bioethical concern involves the potential misuse of genetic data, particularly in ways that could harm vulnerable populations. The 2023 data breach revealed that hackers specifically targeted information related to the Ashkenazi Jewish and Chinese ancestry, raising fears of genetic profiling and discrimination. The principle of justice in bioethics calls for fair treatment and protection of all individuals, yet the exposure of genetic data for specific ethnic groups creates new risks for discrimination. While the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, provides legal protection against genetic discrimination in employment and health insurance, it does not cover life insurance, disability insurance, or long-term care insurance. This loophole means that individuals whose genetic information is compromised could face discrimination in crucial areas of their lives. Furthermore, in an era of rising authoritarianism and technological surveillance, the possibility of governments or corporations using genetic data for racial profiling or other unethical purposes can't be ignored. The potential misuse of genetic information highlights the need for stricter regulations governing direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies. The ethical dilemmas surrounding 23andMe highlight a broader issue in the biotech industry: the lack of comprehensive regulations to protect consumer genetic data. Unlike traditional medical data, which is protected under the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, genetic data from direct-to-consumer testing companies does not receive the same level of protection. This regulatory gap leaves consumers vulnerable to privacy violations and data misuse. 23andMe's privacy policy states that in the event of financial distress or bankruptcy, personal genetic data may be sold or transferred to another entity. This raises the risk of DNA data being acquired by data brokers, insurance companies, or even foreign governments. So, what are some possible solutions? Given the risks associated with genetic data breaches, bioethicists and policymakers argue that stronger federal protections are necessary. It would be best for a multi-step approach and a combination of policies, such as expanding HIPAA protections to include direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies, banning the sale of genetic data in bankruptcy proceedings, ethical business model shifts, moving towards nonprofit or public-private partnerships for research, and equitable access and protections against genetic discrimination should be expanded to cover all forms of insurance and employment decisions, as well as mandatory security standards. Companies handling genetic data should be held to a higher cybersecurity standard to prevent breaches and unauthorized access, creating a right-to-be-forgotten law similar to the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, allowing consumers to request the permanent deletion of their genetic information, and finally, an enhanced transparency and informed consent law with direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies. They should be implementing clearer, more accessible consent forms that explicitly explain how data will be used. The next few slides are pretty detailed, but we can dive a little deeper into these problems and solutions for those of you that are curious. So here we have 23andMe's terms of service currently allows for genetic data to be sold or transferred in bankruptcy proceedings. Consumers are not the legal owners of their genetic data once it's submitted, creating bioethical and legal risks. 23andMe also doesn't guarantee permanent deletion of genetic data, as some third-party research agreements may retain copies of consumer DNA. Some solutions to these problems would be to make consumer DNA legally owned by the individual and require explicit revocable consent for any usage beyond personal reports. mandate a right to be forgotten policy where users can request full permanent deletion of their data at any time, and require that genetic data may be fully anonymized before being used in research, ensuring no individual or ancestral groups can be targeted. To prevent the sale of DNA data in bankruptcy proceedings, we could have federal legislation ban the sale of genetic data, require that genetic data be deleted if a company fails or undergoes acquisition, and restrict foreign ownership of genetic databases to prevent international misuse. As things stand right now, 23andMe and a lot of direct-to-consumer companies are for-profit. And the for-profit model incentivizes data sales even without true informed consent. And then ethical concerns arise when consumer data is being used for corporate gain without compensation to the donors or true transparency. Some solutions would be to convert 23andMe into a nonprofit or public-private partnership where DNA research is driven by medical progress and not profits. Allow consumers to opt in to a research foundation where their data is used solely for public health and medical advancements, similar to NIH initiatives, and to give financial incentives or discounts to users who voluntarily contribute their data for ethical research. So as mentioned earlier, 23andMe's informed consent forms are misleading. Right now they are complex and often unclear as to how data is being used, and they also have opt-in options for data sharing that are often hidden or confusing. It might be wise to introduce stricter regulations and require simplified consent forms, ensuring that users understand who has access to their DNA and for what purpose. Maybe to mandate reconsent for every new usage case, such as if a pharmaceutical company wants access, users can explicitly approve or deny it, and perhaps to implement third-party audits and oversight to verify compliance. This is the last one of these slides with problems and solutions, but I do think it is the most important one. I guess I'm most shocked about how all of this went down, given that I just assumed that all of our genetic data was going to be protected the same way that our data is protected by hospitals. And so I think it should be, and that's what this slide is talking about here. Unlike medical records, it's not covered under HIPAA. Consumers have fewer legal protections when using direct-to-consumer genetic testing services. I would hope that we would expand HIPAA to cover genetic testing companies and require the same level of data security that hospitals and clinics have, mandate end-to-end encryption for all stored genetic data, ban genetic data from being used in life insurance, disability insurance, and employment decision, which would close the loopholes in the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So in many ways, 23andMe is a warning sign for the future of the genetic testing industry. Questions ought to be raised about what we value and what we are trying to accomplish. 23andMe's ethical failures expose the dangers of privatized genetic data and the inadequacy of current regulations in protecting consumers. The company's history of data breaches, questionable consent practices, and potential bankruptcy raise critical bioethical questions about privacy, corporate responsibility, and the commodification of human DNA. Moving forward, it is imperative that policymakers, bioethicists, and consumers push for stronger protections to prevent the exploitation of genetic information. If 23andMe is allowed to sell its data as it collapses, the future of genetic privacy remains at risk, setting a dangerous precedent for the biotech industry. The fundamental question remains, should our genetic data be treated as private property or as an asset that is owned by corporations? This concludes my presentation, and here is the bibliography for further information. Thank you very much.